Okay, here we go. I'm ready to do this again. Okay, welcome to my studio. My name's Michael Markowsky, and today we're going to recreate another painting by another one of my all-time very favorite artists. This time we're going to be looking at probably the most well-known artist of the 20th century. When anyone says the name artist, this is probably the name you think of. And I've certainly taken my time coming around to today's artist because he has a questionable past, and we'll talk about that in today's episode. But today is also the International Day of Peace. It's I'm a big believer in peace over violent conflict, as I think most people are, but certain people are more willing to go to war than others. I've been involved in the Canadian Forces Artist Program, and I've spent time with the men and women who have served in various conflicts. And I would like to think that I'm one of the last war artists that will ever be. We'll knock on wood about that, but we can also talk about that throughout. Anyway, we're going to be looking at Pablo Picasso today, and two of Picasso's most iconic images. These are two drawings or lithographs, prints that he made to promote the cause of peace. And this one was, this is Dove of Peace from 1949, and this is Peace Dove from 1961. And he did a few other, he did a couple of other doves, which we'll look at here shortly. These are my two favorite personally. And he also did a number of major anti-war artworks throughout his career, Guernica being probably the most famous, but he did do a few other ones as well. So let's dive right into it here. So before we take a look at the image itself, I just want to let you know that there's a private Facebook group just for people like yourself who are watching today. Most of the people who are watching this episode and who will ultimately watch this episode have never seen me or heard of me or anything before. So what we do here is I'm recreating this artwork, and I invite you to do the same and to upload your version of today's painting to the Facebook group. And then once a month, I take a look at all the artwork that's been created and posted on the group and give people some feedback and see if we can make them even better than they already are, as well as to give you some good old-fashioned kudos and congratulations, because anybody making art, I think, is helping to improve the world. If everyone was making art, I think we would live in a very, very different world than we do today. So join the Facebook group. It's also a super supportive community of artists, like-minded artists, people who are just at the beginning of their learning process, and some people that have been painting with me for over a year now. And it's really exciting for people to be surrounded by people who have experienced the same sort of thing, that have a little bit of ideas of what my sort of approach to painting is, so they can also give you some feedback without me even jumping in, because that happens all the time. So anyway, if you click on a link in the description below for the Dropbox, you're going to see all of these folders. These are all paintings that we've made so far. Some names are going to be very familiar. You see Van Gogh and Leonardo da Vinci and Thompson in here, Grandma Moses. Some names you may or may not be as familiar with, but rest assured they are some of the greatest artists, greatest people to have ever walked this earth. If we click in here, number 70, Pablo Picasso, you'll see 6 files. Those 6 files include the 2 original images, as well as outlines that I did for them. Now, these are fairly simple images, so whether you need the outline or not is up to you. but here's another outline. And so that accounts for 4, and then there's PDF versions of the 2 outlines as well, depending on your printer at home if you want to use those. Now let's just take a quick second to look at Picasso, the artist, and his biography, because we'll talk about him throughout today's episode. But he was born in Spain, and in 1881, and then lived a very long life. 1973 was when he passed away at the age of 91. And there's lots of other artists who were born around this period of time that we've talked about, and I think Picasso is sort of one of those persons that so many people are familiar with that I often will say, oh, he was born around the same time as Picasso. People are like, oh, okay, so late 1800s. That makes sense, right? A few things just right off the top. Picasso is famous for all sorts of different reasons, some positive, some negative, but Picasso, his style, well, he had many different styles, which is one of the unique things about him. And we're actually going to be doing a whole week on Pablo Picasso in October. So we're going to be spending a week looking at all the different styles: the blue period, the rose period, his cubist period, and his neoclassical period. And I mean, we could get, and there's little tiny even segments within those as well. But he is really known as the co-inventor of Cubism. And Cubism we're going to look at in October as part of, as I said, that Picasso week. But he's also the co-inventor of collage. So cutting out images, gluing them onto paintings, painting over top of them, incorporating newspapers, all those kind of like just found materials, not only into paintings and drawings, but also into sculpture. So he was a radical innovator. And also I should say that the co-inventor of both Cubism and collage was a French artist named Georges Braque, who we will talk about in a future episode as well, because I actually prefer Braque's Cubist paintings to Picasso's. So Braque is often the guy that gets left out of the conversation. He's a pretty towering figure in art anyway, but certainly not at the level of Picasso's recognition. There are thousands of books written about Picasso and his biography, and there's books that his various wives have written, and various lovers that he had over his time. Picasso is, without a doubt, a misogynist. He was a terrible person, and a horrible, horrible person who terrorized the women in his life. I just want to share a couple of links here, because talking about Picasso without talking about the elephant in the room would do a great disservice, especially in the world that we're living in today. And I'm a father of a 2-year-old girl, and I hope that the world that she lives in is very different than the world that these young women lived in, and who were intimate with Picasso. So I'm not going to go through all of these texts, but there's links in the description if you want to read more in. Where was I thought I had another really great article. Oh, so here's like 16 times Pablo Picasso would have been called out during the Me Too movement if he were alive today. Basically, if Picasso was alive today, he would be sort of consigned to his own little area, and certainly would not be as embraced as he is today. But anyway, it's very hard, it's interesting because the art world is going through the sort of Me Too movement right now, or over the past few years, and there is a lot of artists who led very questionable lives in art history, and as we sort of kind of go back and reevaluate them, Picasso is certainly one of those persons that is due for a reevaluation, amongst a number of other fellows. But we want to talk about peace today, and not about some of his transgressions as a person. And these images that Picasso did celebrate peace and promote the cause of peace are I like to think of them as gestures from his better side. The part of Picasso that wanted to make the world a better place, and he was very aware of how hugely popular he was and the power he had as an artist and as a person. And there's, I'm sure there's tons of information, there's movies that have been made about this, but during World War II, Picasso stayed in Paris even when the Nazis occupied Paris. When Hitler moved into Paris, Picasso made a decision to stay there. Most of the other well-known artists left France, or left Europe. Most of them came to the United States, and some came to Canada or South America. Very few of them stayed in Paris. A few of them moved to the south of France, like Matisse, but Picasso stayed in the heart of the hurricane, and he stayed there and he worked. He was harassed by the SS, the German secret police, and the military, but Hitler knew that rounding up Picasso, unlike many of the other artists that he rounded up and sent to concentration camps and were subsequently murdered, Picasso was such a gigantic, towering figure, arguably the most famous person in the world, maybe him and Charlie Chaplin, who also had a really interesting relationship, or anti-relationship to Hitler. He knew that if something were to happen to Picasso, it would basically it would be a bridge too far, which is ironic considering the millions, the 6 or 7 millions of Jews that were killed in the Holocaust that people didn't seem to care about. But touching Picasso was too much, which just shows how crazy of a world we're living in, or were living in, and arguably still live in. Anyway, there's a lot of stuff that we could talk about here today. I want to try to stay on track here. So let's talk about how we can begin today's painting here. So let's look at no, I want this here. So what I've got here are some images that I've transferred onto canvas. As I said, I'm going to do 2 paintings today, and these 2 images I've transferred onto canvas. Now I'm going to show you really quickly how that process is done, and I'll talk over this video as it plays here. So you can see that I'm using this is a 9x12 sized canvas, which I've gessoed and then sanded down. These are canvas boards that I order off of Amazon. If you want to get the exact same one, there's a link in the description below. And then I just print out the JPEG or PDF that's there on the Dropbox, and then put a little bit of tape on it to affix it to the canvas. And then I'm using some carbon paper. And you can see this carbon paper I'm using is well used. It's been used maybe 20 times. I think after these drawings, I threw that piece of carbon paper out. It had outlived its life, but certainly, you know, lasted for a couple of months with that one single sheet. And you can see in that pack it came with I think a dozen of them, right? You can also see I sometimes will move the carbon paper around so that I can get at the sides, or if it's a larger image, just so I can be sure that it all fits. And let's just well, pretty self-explanatory. You peel it off. Here's the other one, and I line that up and do the same. Right, I think I moved this over. You can see I did Picasso's signature there just for fun. It's not about trying to make a fake Picasso, and I really hope no one is doing that. It's just the idea of, I think it's actually a critical part of this picture is the autograph of Picasso, because Picasso's one of those persons that is more than just an image. It's like a name brand. And as I said, Picasso knew the power. Like, he would go out for dinner with friends and go and have like a massive feast at the most expensive restaurant wherever he went, and to pay for it, he would literally just he would be like, oh, give me a receipt or a napkin, and then he would do a quick drawing just like this in maybe 2 minutes and trade it for dinner, for all the friends, all of the wine, all of the food that was consumed. And the restaurant owner would be like, wow, that was like a couple $1,000 at least, maybe $5,000-$6,000 dinner, but I could probably sell this drawing for 50 grand right now. So, you know, people were happy to trade him that way. And it's just amazing to think that somebody could just, he had like the golden touch, right? Even during his lifetime. So let's, what we're going to do now is we're going to put some paint on both of these canvases. And they're relatively simple, straightforward images. So, the question is for myself and for you, do you want to do something fun or different here? I think I'm going to just I'm going to paint pretty much what I see and not kind of go too much further. Like I'm going to mix a kind of a bit of a gray, I think. I'm trying to think. I mean, we could do color, but I got two different ones. I mean, so I guess, sorry, what I'm thinking about right now is the color in the background. You know, a little bit of blue could look kind of cool. Maybe I'll do one in, I'll do one just like this, and then I'll do another one with a slightly different color for the background. I think that would be okay. I don't think that's going to upset too many people. So in order to do that, let's get some paint out. And all of the paint I use can easily fit in this shoebox. What colors? I don't know if we'll use all the colors, so we'll probably use warm colors, just because generally I tend to prefer warmer colors over cooler colors. So let's do, which one should I do? I just have this feeling a bit of a baby blue would kind of look nice. So maybe I'll do the baby blue here, and then I'll mix a gray afterwards. Okay. And actually, you know what? The baby... trying to think. You know what? I'm going to use a cool blue for my baby blue. We don't need a lot of it. There's a bit of... we want to keep it mostly white. So let's mix this up. Okay, so here's some white and blue. I think that would look pretty cool, I think. Yeah. So I'm going to take a little bit of water here, and just to dilute it, so that, really a few reasons. One is just so that it dries a little bit faster, and also so that I don't lose all my pencil marks that are on the canvas here. So this is a little bit different. I typically use a cool yellow to do this, as if you've been with me for a while, you know. I guess I just associate this kind of a blue with, you know, the United Nations and peacekeeping force, you know, the blue helmets that the United Nations wear when they're in combat zones. I think that's going to look really cool, actually, now that I look at it. Yeah, I'm happy with this decision. So again, the goal with this is not to go too thick with the white, otherwise you will completely hide your pencil lines. I mean, this is not the most complicated image, so if you did lose those lines, you could you could easily just retrace your the image onto the canvas. The one thing is you would really want it to really wait for that paint to dry as thoroughly as possible, because I've noticed that the carbon paper will stick to paint. So you really want to make sure that the canvas is as dry as humanly possible. So maybe even waiting overnight before you do anything to it. So what I'm doing here is I'm trying to make sure that this paint is on here as thoroughly as possible, and then it's going into all of the weave of the canvas, so I don't really have any big areas of white showing through, which can be a little bit tricky. Sometimes it looks great from one angle, and I notice this a lot when I'm doing these paintings because I'm kind of standing above it and from behind. And sometimes after the episode, I take the painting upstairs and I put it on the mantle, and I go like, whoa, if you look at it from this angle, you can see paint didn't get into all those little valleys there. Anyway, I'm really happy with the way that looks. So I'll just set this to dry. And while that's drying, I'm going to do something slightly different for the other canvas here. So let's mix up another paint here. So with this one, I'm going to add I'm going to make a kind of gray. So I'm going to take some warm red and a little bit of cool yellow, tiny bit of it. Come on. I know there's some left in here. There we go. We don't really need much of the yellow at all, but so to make a gray, you could obviously just use black and white, but if you know me at all, you know that I like to make these colors myself, right? So I'm going to take some of the cool blue and the cool red, and I mix these together, and we get this kind of a purple color. Right, and then we put some yellow in here, the cool yellow, and look at that. It's like magic. Every time it happens, it's just like, wow, that's just crazy. It's alchemy, right? So it goes from purple to gray. I love it. I love it. So that's great, but this is also going to be a little bit dark. So how about I'm just going to take a little bit of that paint off here. I could also use maybe, yeah, actually, I was going to just wipe some of that away, but you know what? Let's just do this over here. Because I also like keeping a little bit of paint that I use for backgrounds, if possible, off to the side, in case something should happen while you're painting. You can kind of go back and use that to touch up the background a little bit. So I'm just taking my brush with this gray that I mixed and put it in here, maybe a little bit. Now I wonder if I should give it a little bit more warmth. So why don't we put a bit of warm yellow in it. So let's mix this up here. So we've got this grayish color, which is fine, but how about we just sort of make it look a little bit more like newsprint, a little bit more like aged paper or something. All right, so just adding a bit more of this warm yellow in there, and that's good. It does make a difference between adding just white and warm yellow versus making this gray and adding yellow to it. Right, in fact, I'm going to put a little bit more white in there. Because these images were not painted on canvas, they were done either, I'm not exactly sure, they were either done on paper and then reproduced by a printmaker, or Picasso himself, because Picasso was a legendary printmaker, and then there were prints made of them, which you can still buy today, although, like with a lot of 20th century prints, the provenance can be a little bit, you know, there's a lot of fakes Picassos floating out there in the world. So just if you're thinking about collecting art from this period of time, just beware that it is, you're swimming with sharks. There's a lot of dubious stuff there to contend with. Now this is a little bit more gray than I was expecting. I mean, I knew when I put some water in there it was going to go gray, but I also don't mind this. Kind of looks a little bit like, it looks a lot like newsprint, except not aged, yellowed newsprint, just newsprint. Okay. Let's zoom back out just a bit. Okay. And, you know, getting a nice background for these paintings is essential, because there's not like there's a lot else going on. We've got the background and some line work on here, so maybe more than any painting we've done over the course of the past year, taking your time with the background is a very prudent step. And again, you could see that I'm going kind of back and forth. You could even, when I used to work for a few different artists when I got out of college, and I would gesso their canvases for them so that they could paint, they were ready to paint. And so I really learned all about like the different ways of prepping a canvas. And the whole point is trying to spread gesso or a wash like this as evenly as possible to avoid any streaks. So that looks pretty good. I'm sort of just gliding the paintbrush over the surface there to get even. That's cool. I'm happy with that. Very good. So I got 2 canvases prepped and ready to run. Okay, a couple of questions. I see Paula's here. Wishes peace for everyone. That's great. Natalie says hello. Hello. Donna says hello everyone, and Patricia says, Michael, how does your paint not dry out when you put it on the side, sometimes for an hour? Mine dries out in 10 minutes. I assume you mean like on the palette. Well, the paint does start to dry. Often you see me squeezing new paint out. I try to not put too much paint on my palette at a time. You know, I've probably people are sick of hearing this, but I often will say, put as much paint on your palette as toothpaste on your toothbrush, because that way there's not a lot of paint on there and you're probably going to use it before it dries out. And then if you need more, you squeeze a little bit more and then you use that. Otherwise, I find, because there's often times where I put, you know, I see this when I teach in person, that if I let people use the paint, they'll squeeze these big blobs of paint out, which will stay nice and wet throughout the entire entire class, but then most of it just goes into the garbage or down the sink afterwards. So yes, you could use a lot of paint, but probably most of it will go to waste. The other thing is just to use less paint, and therefore you'll use it before it dries out. Does that answer your question? Another option, let me just move this out of the way. Another option is a device like this. This is a painting, I don't even know what is this called. Like, it's a, I'm sure everything's got a name. So what would, basically what it is a airtight, actually this is not really airtight anymore. It's well used. I've had it for a couple decades, but essentially there's just a sponge in here, and you get this thing wet, and then you can put your palette in here. I mean, usually this is used for overnight. So you get your sponge wet, and then you just put this over top, and then you could let this sit for a week, and then you just pull this off, and your acrylic paint will still be nice. Your palette will still be nice and wet inside here. You could, I guess you could put a canvas in there, but I would be worried that the canvas would get wet. The wood would get wet and start to warp the canvas itself. But if you were to maybe put some, I don't know, bottle caps or something to keep it elevated, maybe? That's probably not a good idea. Now that I'm thinking about it, you could get some mold and moisture forming in there. You really want to just use your paint. But it's possible that keeping your, like, you could literally have your palette here with a wet sponge and be painting, and the fact that you've got all this moisture around here that's probably slowly evaporating could be recaptured by the paint. If you're working in a particularly dry climate, where, like in Alberta, where I'm originally from, where it's very high and dry, your paint might dry out faster, versus if you're working in a very warm or a humid climate where there's lots of moisture in the air, your paint will probably last a little bit longer. Also, I find colder rooms, colder environments, the paint will stay wet a little bit longer, just because it's, just think about, like, if you had a wet towel, it's going to dry out really fast in hot sun, versus if it's sitting in a dark closet, right? A cold, dark closet. Okay. So these are still a little bit wet, so I think I'm just going to blow dry them just so I can move on to the next step as quickly as possible. So you'll forgive me while I mute the audio for a moment. Okay. Donna's talking about making a wet palette using a cheap container and MIDI cutting board from the Looney store. Yeah. So, you know, you can... I have... I did this myself recently. Maybe I took it to the school. But you can get like large Tupperware containers, you know, that are made for like a big thing of, you know, lasagna or something, right? And that can be sealed up. You know, they either click in, and then you could just put a sponge in there, like one of those ShamWow things. You know, there's infomercials where it you know, you can. It's like a big. Actually, I know I have a ShamWow here in the studio. It's just a disaster at the moment, but it looks a lot like that kind of sponge. It's like a cloth that you can dip into water, and it acts as this huge sponge. Anyway, you could put that on the bottom, or you could just use regular sponges. The idea is just to keep it wet. I do remember I used to share a studio with an artist who would use like a hairspray gun. He would just fill with water, and he would occasionally just sort of mist his palette so it would stay wet. I can't. I've never done that personally. Off the top of my head, I kind of am skeptical about that, of just introducing little droplets of water. But maybe that's just an unfounded anxiety. I just. I guess I don't see why that wouldn't work. At the time, I was an oil painter, so it all just seemed like a different universe to me. Lolly's joining us here. I hope I haven't missed too much. Happy Peace Day to you as well. And Donna says, I love my ShamWow. Okay, so let's do this one first. So obviously I've changed it by putting this warm, or actually this is a cool blue, my apologies, a cool blue with some white on here. So with a painting like this, where there's really very little to put on here, there's a few different ways we can go about this. One way we can do this is to paint this very quickly, almost like the way that Picasso drew, because you could see in this image, it's done like he drew this very fast. Like there's all the hallmarks of a very quickly drawn image, like these type of kind of swirling marks here. Like this is a line that's probably coming very quickly. So if you want to recreate that, do I want to do that? I might use I'm trying to think. Maybe I'll do a few different ways of doing this. One of which I might use some of my fluid acrylics, because the fluid acrylic creates a really nice fluid mark, which means I'm not going to have to do too much little kind of noodling with my paintbrush. I can just sort of dip my paint in and then paint a lot longer. You'll also see, do I have any of these here? And one technique is you can use a really long brush. So this is kind of like a sign painter's brush. And the idea is it's got a really long hair here, right? Like most, like you can see the, let's zoom in. Right, so a lot of these small paintbrushes have very small hairs, whereas this one has a much longer one. And the benefit of that is it's going to soak in lots of paint, and then you can paint for longer with it. It definitely takes some getting used to painting with a really long bristle, because you lose a little bit of control. But it's sort of like a calligraphy pen, if you've ever used like a real calligraphy pen, where you dip it in and then you see the ink kind of get sucked up between the two halves of metal. So that's a process. So maybe should I do this one? Let me see. I've got a few other fluid acrylics. So I'm just getting out a bunch of different colors here. I'll paint one with just the regular acrylic paint that we've been using throughout the entire class, and then I might do one with fluid acrylic just so you can see the difference between the two different types of materials. And this will go a lot easier using, let's say, this fluid acrylic. Oh, it's such a shallow depth of... Come on. There we are. So, you know, fluid acrylic is like... You can hear the water in there versus the tube of paint like this. You know, it's just sort of... It's like cookie dough. It's not going to move that much, right? So obviously doing fine detailing with the fluid acrylic is easier. Should I do that first? And which one should I do it with? Maybe I'll do... Sorry, obviously this, I think I do all of my thinking live. Which, so what I'm trying to think is which one makes sense to, which one is the more complicated one, because it would make sense to use a fluid acrylic because it will go faster and it will make my life easier, versus which one is, but then having said that, using fluid acrylic for the more simple one also makes sense because it will, the fluid acrylic will ultimately make it look best, and if there's not that many lines, gosh, what it's, and I guess I could use it for both, but maybe, okay, let's just start here. Okay, so I'm gonna use fluid acrylic for this, and let's back this out. I'm just gonna focus this really quickly. Okay, so to do the outlines for this image, I'm going to use some black fluid acrylic, just a little bit of it. And you don't need a lot of this material. It goes a long way. Let's use some of this dark blue, perhaps. So this is like my ultramarine blue, or this is probably, yeah, cyan. So this is, you know, we've talked about, it's kind of like a cobalt blue, what this is. This is kind of like in between my ultramarine blue and my cerulean blue that I use here, right? So just as a quick little thing. We've talked about this before because some people buy cobalt blue. This cobalt blue exists in between these guys on the color wheel, which is why I tend to recommend using, you know, going for a little bit more extreme colors, because you can always kind of bridge them by just mixing them together. Anyway, they don't make quite as many, there's not as many options when it comes to fluid acrylic colors here. So, essentially what I want for this image is, I've got this kind of baby blue here with the cold blue, my cerulean blue and white, and I want to make a color. It's not quite black. It's like going to be a really, really dark navy blue. That's why I've added a little bit of black here. So I'm just going to mix a bit of navy blue or a bit of black in here to just darken that a bit. Because I always find just black is on its own is a kind of pretty boring color. It just is such a deadening color. I want some life in here. Okay, so let's move this out of the way. Get some of this fluid acrylic on here, and then we're going to paint this now. Now, what I would say, just like, especially when you're using when you're doing a painting that has very little room for error, is before you start painting, you may want to just think of literally trying to paint on another surface, just to kind of warm up a little bit, right? Just to kind of get the feeling down before you launch right into it, so that you feel like the first brushstroke that you've done for the day is not right on the canvas, but somewhere else. All right, so the other thing I'm going to do is sort of just practice these marks here. Okay. Now, I'm not too happy with that line. It was a little bit wobbly, and you saw that I kind of went over it again. Before I just keep on going and finish this, I'm actually going to go around the whole thing here. And that way, if I need to radically widen things, then I'll do it at that point. Okay. You can see I'm sort of like practicing my line here. Okay, so that was kind of a good beginning. You could do many versions of this until you feel like you've got it right. You know, I guess a question in my mind is, do I want to do it all in one go? And that would give it a real feeling of spontaneity, or do I want to try to make it perfect, right? In which case I might see a little bit more of a hesitant kind of mark making, which I see here already. But I'll try to clean that up as I go. So let's zoom in here. You see a kind of, I think of this as like my golf swing, right? Even though I've never played golf, I've seen enough golf and pop culture to, you know, you kind of practice the swing. Some of these are pretty awkward because they involve kind of pulling this way and then pulling back up the other way, so involving kind of changing the direction where I'm pulling this and then pulling around, because I don't want to go like this and then try to push on the brush, otherwise it's going to stutter, right? So generally when you're painting, you want to be kind of pulling around and pulling back up, right? Pulling down, pulling up, rather than pulling down and pushing back up. And, you know, let's say I'll do this as two. I'll kind of stop halfway, right? And then I can also kind of go back up this way. Okay, now that's a big arc, and trying to do this way is very awkward. Like, I'll show you. So this arc is pretty awkward for me to paint that way, but it's a lot easier for me to paint it this way, right? Because it kind of conforms more to my natural shape of my wrist. So I'm not happy really with any of the lines that I've made here, but the point is I want to get it started, and then I can kind of go in and refine things as I go here. So in fact, I'm going to start. I don't want my sleeve dragging on anything here. So, if anything, what I've just done there is that little bit of a dotted line is actually very helpful, because now I can see it. Because often also what happens when you're doing this type of thing is you lose the... You can, especially if you're drawing in here and you can hardly see these pencil lines, it's like I'm creating a bit of a guideline for myself. Right? In fact, I'll just do quickly that over a lot of this. In fact, this would be, now that I think of it, as a pretty good technique for anyone doing this painting, is doing a quick little line like that over top, and then I can kind of go back over top of it. Yeah, well, let's do this, and then we'll get the whole thing done, and then I'm going to come back and refine everything. Now, I know there's some people who are sign painters who could do this whole thing in about 2 minutes. That is an awesome skill. If you want to just be amazed, just Google or YouTube sign painting, like traditional sign painting, and it is absolutely, it's a art in and of itself. It's almost a dead art, although it certainly has made a bit of a comeback, kind of a, you know, this just like a lot of other kind of things that were dead have kind of made a bit of a comeback, because it is such a beautiful thing to see painting done, or like signs painted by hand. There's just nothing like it out there. So let's take a look. Now this one here, I can't get right into the middle because it's all wet paint, so I am going to kind of do an out, just a very rough line here to help me. I'll do this one backwards. Okay, so now, I mean, like, you could see right here where maybe this head should come up and it's a little bit flat here and maybe should kind of swoop down. So as I go over this again, actually, maybe before I do that, let's just take a look at it at this stage. You know, maybe I could even leave it like that, quite honestly, but I'm gonna thicken these lines a little bit and just clean it up. But you know, there's that first stage where I've just outlined everything. So again, let's zoom back in. Okay, so you got a little bit wide there. So what I'm going to end up doing is just widen everything in order to make it work. One thing I'm noticing, it looks like this brush is, I've ordered some new brushes, but this brush is on its last legs because I see it's creating a little, like there's one or two stray hairs that are leaving undesired marks. Yikes. Where should I go now? What I'm looking for is just the most natural sort of path for my wrist to go when I'm making this painting. I saw in the chat, Lolly says, you used to be an oil painter, hey? Do you mainly paint with acrylic now? Do you prefer acrylics over oils? I've never used oils, but I would like to. Yeah, originally, well, when I was in art school, many, many years ago, for my undergraduate degree, I painted in acrylic paints. And then when I went to graduate school, I started painting in oil paint. Because I was sort of one of those things where oil painting is a bit of it's a learning curve. It's different, not super different, but it has its own kind of methods and things to kind of keep in mind. And I thought, like, you know what, if I'm going to do this, I should probably do this while I'm still in school, where I'm surrounded by people who can give me some advice and help me work through some problems and answer questions, etc. And so I made that transition. So that was like 20 years ago. And I really like, oil painting to me is a lot more like an alchemical, mysterious process. Like if you're into kind of chemistry and you're into the, another way to think of it might be thinking about the difference between Mac or Apple computers and PC computers. Acrylic is a lot more like an Apple computer in that it's pretty straightforward. Like, we've made all of these paintings with, 8 tubes of paint, 6 colors, and black and white. And we've used some slow dry medium. We haven't used that a lot recently. And we've used some glazing fluid. I guess we've used some matte medium as well, but really, that's it, right? 6, the paint. And really, if all you really need is paint and maybe glazing fluid. And really, that's all you would need in order to get off the ground as an acrylic painter. And you can clean it up really easy. It's not going to upset your friends or roommates or your partner because it doesn't have any smell. It dries almost instantly within, for the most part, your acrylic painting will be dry before you're done cleaning up, right? Which is, very exciting for people who share spaces with other people. I'm sure a lot of people don't have a dedicated studio, and they might, put some newspaper down on their kitchen table after everyone's gone to sleep or while the kids are at school, kind of thing. And that's their. And then they make a painting and they want to be able to clean it all up, put everything away into boxes on the shelf, and use the table for other things. So acrylic is awesome for that because it's, it's just there's really, I guess watercolor and gouache are similar, that they're very transportable and easy to set up and take down. Acrylic paint, oil paint couldn't be more different. Oil paint can take months to dry. If you make an oil painting, it can literally take months or more. If you look into it, you'll hear some people talking about that there's some oil paint that will never dry, that has been drying for literally hundreds of years. And so it has this much more like of an alive kind of feeling to it, that you can paint into the wet paint weeks after while it's still drying. Now, that's not always the case. There are things you can add to oil paint to speed up its drying process. I know many people here have asked me to teach an oil painting course. But honestly, I probably won't get to something like that until maybe next summer, if just because honestly the audience for oil painting is very small these days. It used to be most, like, any serious painter would use oil paint. Like, you wouldn't, like, literally when I was in art school, people would say, these are great acrylic paintings, but if you want to sell these, you're going to have to learn how to paint in oil, because no serious collector is going to buy an acrylic painting. Now, even back then, I was sort of doubtful of that advice, but I was also noticing that my friends who painted in oil were selling all their paintings and selling them for lots of money, and thought, well, I'm sure that's there might be a few people that believe that to this day, but I think that sentiment is definitely in the minority. You know, over the past 20 years, more and more people paint in oil paint, and that bias, I think, has been largely disproven. I mean, there were people like Andy Warhol was painting in acrylic paint back in the 1960s, when acrylic paint was still a very much a new material, especially for artists. So there's been there's people who've kind of blown that door down decades ago, but still that idea persisted for a long time. Anyway, so oil paint, you really kind of need a space that you can kind of, you know, you can paint and then you can walk away and leave everything there, because cleaning up after oil paint is a bit of a pain in the butt. So if you have, I know there's some of you who've posted pictures on the Facebook group of your studios, and you have a beautiful space right in front of a window, and you've got, you know, shelves of paint, and it looks like you've got a dedicated space. So painting with oils is not a problem. But as I said, it's definitely, there's, I've talked about this before in previous episodes. Like, when I used to go to the art supply store, 90% of all of the paint was oil paint, and there would be just a couple shelves with acrylic, and they were sort of marketed as student grade, because that's when I was a student, and I'm not that old. You would learn how to paint in acrylic, and then you would transition to oil paint eventually once you figured it out. And also because at the time, anyway, oil paint could be slightly toxic and have a smell, and so when you painted in a studio, you know, if you're sharing studios with people who didn't paint, you know, and the smell of turpentine would anger them, and they'd be like, "Oh God, open a window, it stinks in here." Now, there's certainly, there's many ways to use oil paint that is much safer, doesn't even barely smells at all, and so I use a brand of oil paint called Gamblin. So here's the brand of oil paint that I use, Gamblin paint. And although they'll say that they're not oil paint, they're oil colors, they make a great point of saying it's not paint at all, which I've never quite understood. But the thing with Gamblin is Robert Gamblin was the head conservator at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., in the United States. And so he was always tasked with mixing up paint that they could use to paint, to fix, you know, Leonardo da Vinci's and Renoirs and Matisse's and Picasso's when they were flaking and cracking. So he's still alive. He's an expert colorist, and he eventually decided to go into business for himself and manufacture paint, or oil colors, again, as he likes to call it. And you can go, I've visited the Gamblin factory. It's just like it's not that big of a space down in Portland, Oregon. Very nice people, and you know, like, my wife just sat in the car outside. It was like, but I'm a geek for that kind of thing. It was like, for me, it was like going to Mecca. You know, it's like, wow, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life. There's a lot of other things to do in Portland than go look at and anybody can go there. Obviously, you'd want to call in advance, but you wouldn't just want to show up, because it's a working facility, but it's not that big. There's maybe 10 people that work there, 10, maybe less, at any one time. But they have these huge, they're not even huge, they're about the size of like it looks like, you know, like restaurant kind of equipment that mixes the paint and then squeezes it out, kind of like through like a pasta, you know, I don't know if you ever used one of those things where you put your own pasta through a machine, you crank it, and then spaghetti comes out or whatever. They have a machine like that where they put all the pigment into this thing and they mix it, and then it squeezes out, because I want to make sure that the paint is even in the tubes, right? So it's just like, this was probably a decade ago now. I would have probably shown up with a really nice camera and documented it and filmed it and put it on YouTube or something. But it's like, for me, it was like being Charlie in the Chocolate Factory, right? Just the most cool thing if you like color. Maybe the only other thing that I've seen that kind of rivals that is the markets in Marrakesh. The souks in North Africa. I visited probably about 10 years. Probably it was maybe that same summer. I went there with my grandmother and my aunt. And we also watched them dyeing fabric, which is maybe kind of a little bit appalling conditions. People waist deep in pigment, flinging fabric around and wringing it out and drying it to make these blankets, and dyeing yarn that will be used in weaving of rugs and garments. But it is like visually the most beautiful, amazing thing. Just these big pools of bright yellow and red and orange. It's just, I don't think people should be up to their waist in pigment, because sometimes these pigments can be very toxic, right? You don't really... Most art tools you can buy at your local art supply store are safe, right? Because that's just, we've evolved as a species, and companies don't want to get sued, and so they use alternative, mostly synthetic materials that are much safer. Like, so your cadmium red these days doesn't actually have cadmium in it, because cadmium is horribly poisonous. So And that used to be, that's one of the things that some people I remember reading a few decades ago. Some people said maybe that's what drove Van Gogh mad, even though a lot of people suggest Van Gogh wasn't mad at all anymore, but that he would, paint and like lick his paintbrush in order to get a nice kind of sharp point while he was painting with oil paints and cadmiums, and that got into his bloodstream and could have affected it. If he did that, which we do know he did do, it certainly would have had some negative health consequences for sure. When I was in art school, wow, oh my goodness, there's so many things in the chat. Okay, I've been zoned out making paintings and just blabbing here. But just to finish a thought, when I was in art school, I remember I had a teacher who used to be a printmaker, who had to retire from printmaking because he, it was in a time in the 60s where artists didn't wear any protective equipment, and they were using materials that are now known to be highly toxic. And so I remember he literally could not be in a room if people were using Sharpie markers, because the smell of the Sharpies was so intense. For him, he had become so sensitive to that material that it was just he had to give up printmaking, which was his material of choice, which is just super tragic. So this is a little bit tricky trying to get into a spot like this. And might lead to some lines that I'm not as happy with, just because it's a little bit tricky. So, you're looking at the painting right up close, and you're seeing all of the much more kind of hesitant line work than maybe I'd want people to see. But after this painting's done, no one's going to look at this painting as closely as you're looking at it right now, and as I'm looking at it, right? Depending on which way you want to look at it, that's the benefit or the tragedy of making art, is that most people never look at art very closely. And so if it is a little bit, if these lines aren't perfect, most people will never know. So just keep spinning it, trying to see, is there a way I can get closer to it? And then I just keep on making it wider and wider. Okay, let's zoom back. Oh, oops, the other way. Pretty good. And we'll just kind of look at this side by side. Wow, you guys have been busy here typing away. Deborah's teaching grandkids guitar. Grandson's 9 loves Bob Marley's 3 Little Birds, a great song. And the granddaughter is 6 and teaching her ukulele, or how do you, the proper way to say ukulele is not ukulele, it's I remember it's ukulele. I can't. I know I'm pronouncing it wrong. There's a proper way that sounds a little bit strange to say, but it's the right way of saying it. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about oil paint here in a second, because there's again, a few more questions about that. Before I move on, now, you know, I see the way that I've got this is this little stem is blue. Is that, let me just take a look. Okay, so this is a lithograph that Picasso did to use for the 1949 Paris Peace Conference. This is maybe, this is like the official one that he did, although I think I'm not as big a fan of it. Is that blue or is that green? It's green. So here you can see this is the pencil drawing that he did, and then it was reproduced again by, I think, the Musée d'Orsay in Paris as a print. Yeah, so here you can see this is the original, or this is a print of the original, so you can even see how loose this is. Anyway, I was just checking because I wanted to see if this stem was green or blue like that, and as I look, it looks like it was actually green. So I did do a little photoshopping on this to clean it up for our purpose. So I'm going to use green instead of blue here on mine. Although maybe I should do his signature while I'm right here. Oops. Ooh. Before I move on to a totally different color. So. Yeah, I'll just leave that. Okay. I will go up here. But before I do that, I'm going to mix a color here. So for the green, oops, let's do this. So Lolly asks about oil paint. Oil paint does look good to work with, but it has all the extras that seem daunting to me. Acrylics are so much straightforward. Grab some water and brush, and you're ready to go. Yeah, so that's what I was saying. The difference between PCs and Mac computers is kind of like the difference between acrylics and oils, in the sense that acrylics, you can just start using immediately, and there's not really a lot of, the learning curve is pretty small. Just like an Apple computer, you take it out of the box, open it up, and you can pretty much start using it. Versus a PC often requires a little bit more setup and a little bit more sometimes installing things can be a bit of a pain in the butt, and I've used both of them. I've owned both of them. I do use mostly Mac computers now, just because where I teach everything is Mac, so it's just so much easier just to go from one platform. But some people really love PC computers because they want to be able to customize everything, and they find Mac computers too limiting. So I'm just going to mix this together here. So again, I'm just using the fluid acrylics, at least for this painting, just for its ease of use. Maybe I'll use regular acrylics, heavy body acrylics that I've used every episode in the past, almost, for the other painting. It's just, I think, I'm just using something a little bit different, because often it's helpful for people to see. Like, using fluid acrylics for this type of thing is easier, because the fluid acrylics are, like you hear, it's more fluid. So being able to do outlining, it just makes your life easier. Because this is often the consistency people want when they're painting small details with their heavy body acrylics, and it's driving them crazy, and then they add lots of water in there to thin them out. But water in your acrylic paint just dilutes the color. Yes, it makes it maybe a little bit easier to paint, but then you have to paint over it like 6 times in order to get it to be a little bit darker and more opaque, right? So okay. So I'm going to start by doing some outlining. I can see this is looks like this yellow is maybe I didn't shake it up enough. It's certainly not as opaque as I'd like to, because now it's looking like I gotta do another layer here, which is fine. It's just a bit of a pain. It kind of defeats a little bit of the purpose of using this particular material. Okay, so I think I'm going to blow dry that. Just, it'll speed up this process. So I'm going to mute my microphone momentarily. So it looks like it also takes a little bit more time to dry with the hair dryer. And you know, it's interesting, this, I guess part of me feels like I want this point to come right down there, a little bit closer to the beak. It's one of those things where you're like, well, it's not how the original was done, but does that mean that's how mine has to be done? Maybe that's okay. I guess well, it looks a little bit darker because it's on this blue background, so. But if I just zoom back out, that's good. Do I want to put a little dot there? I don't know. I think that's fine. I think that one's okay. I think I can feel free and happy walking away from that. This one here. Okay. So there's one of 2 paintings completed. I'm just gonna reboot this app because something weird is going on. So I just want to see if so while this dries, so I mentioned I use I don't, so rather than using, if you're going to use oil paint, you know, this is my favorite brand, Gamblin, I think is the best. It's just super high quality. It's a relatively small company, so if you have any problems, you can literally call them up and ask them for advice on materials, which is generally the case with every art brand, material brand that I've ever used. You can call them up and it's not like they're McDonald's or like a, you know, Chase Manhattan Bank where there's, you know, 4, you know, like, I was gonna say 400,000 employees around the world. This is a company that, or any paint company, might have maybe 20 employees, and they're not making churning out stuff all the time. Often they're sending people out to do for selling and promoting their products, and they might only manufacture things maybe a couple days a week. Anyway, they're happy to give you some advice. And same thing with Gamblin. Now this here, Gamsol, is basically an alternative to turpentine, and I strongly recommend this. This is odorless mineral spirits, which you can buy separate. You don't have to buy the Gamblin version of odorless mineral spirits. In fact, I have a giant jug of it back there. I'll just bring it out. Right, so this is having, oh, here's the English version on the other side. So this is much better for you than using turpentine. Turpentine is poison. It's just, and it's horribly, like, you know, most art supply stores don't even sell turpentine anymore. So I often hear people saying, like, oil paint is super toxic. It's not that toxic. I mean, you wouldn't want to drink even odorless mineral spirits, but it doesn't have quite the same smell. Actually, often the smell is the paint itself. And personally, I love the smell of oil paint. The other thing that is a little, and I don't have the actual original tube, but is not Gamsol, not Gamvar. They have their own, but it's basically linseed oil that you mix into the paint, and the linseed oil is also basically what's in your oil paint to begin with. So you'd add a little bit more of that to thicken the paint, and you'd add some turpentine, if you're still using turpentine, like your or odorless mineral spirits to thin the paint. So it's just when I paint with oil paint, I feel more like I'm in a direct conversation with like Leonardo da Vinci or, you know, Rembrandt or something, because I'm using materials that aren't too much different than what they used 400, 500, 600 years ago, right? Whereas acrylic paint has really only been around, was invented, I think, in like the 1920s, wasn't really commercially available until the 50s, and even then it wasn't like you could go to an art supply store and buy acrylic paint until the maybe 70s, I'd say, maybe. Okay, so let's tackle this one. And maybe this one, rather than using my fluid acrylics, which are great, I'm just going to use regular heavy body paints to do this, which might give me a little bit more grief, but I'm sure there's probably 95% of you out there are also in that same situation. So I'll try to execute this painting with the same type of materials that everyone else has at home. So before I do that, let's just take a look at the image. So this one is using, this is again is that cobalt blue, which is a blue in between the two blues that I have. So let's put some of that. Oh, I don't need that much. But I'll put them both on here and we'll mix. Basically, it's the same, it's like the same blue that we used, you know, right out of the tube here, right? It's in between. People might call it your primary blue. So maybe I'll just start with that before I mix any more colors. Let's just paint with this here. Okay, and we'll mix it just right off to the side here. So basically, cobalt blue exists in between my warm blue and my cool blue. So I can make, it's not going to get exactly the same color, and every pigment also has its own properties with light fastness, like how resistant it is to fading, its opacity, like how transparent it is or how opaque it is. So, but we're simulating cobalt blue by just mixing those two colors together. Wally says, your line work is always really impressive. The learning to do line work, I mean, when I was in art school, I had teachers would say the same thing, because I was also doing like kind of pop art, and I was projecting images from comic books and newspapers and painting it and doing a lot of lettering. And I used to draw comics when I was younger, when I was in high school, and doing a lot of that kind of thing is just very time consuming, but it's you get better at it the more you do, and it's a skill that you build up through practice. That's why I've also tried with these episodes to have some paintings which are very expressive, and we get to really play with the paint, like the Anna Molka Almond, where we're using the palette knife and gooey, thick paint. I mean, I love, those are some of my favorite painting. My wife loves them. And then contrasting that with like painting Batman and Superman and Spider-Man, where we're doing lots of little line work. Because even if you don't care about superheroes, those require you to work on building that line work skill in order to execute them. And they're not just useful for doing Spider-Man, but for all sorts of other things as well. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in. Let's start right on in the middle here. Although, you know what? Maybe rather than starting in the middle, I should do some of these things that are going to be a little bit more tricky for me to do later. So I'm going to kind of work left to right. And the same sort of thing, I'm just going to build in a guideline for myself. So the temptation here is to start adding water into your acrylic paint in order to make it more fluid. And as I said, that is a recipe for major frustration. I see people doing it all the time, even when I tell them not to. And you don't. It's not against the law. It's just that it's going to make the paint really transparent, and you might have to do multiple layers in order to kind of get the color you want. And you can already see this paint is kind of transparent already, right? I find blues tend to be kind of transparent. So anyway, so I'll do the same thing I did with the previous painting, which is to just kind of paint it in once and then go back over it a second time to potentially widen my lines because I'll have to kind of darken some of these anyway. I could put a little bit of white into the color in order to help make it a little bit more opaque, but of course by tinting it, it'll be a different color. I've seen some people put black in there, but it'll just radically change it. So you could also try painting it just more thickly. But the thing is, if you paint more, like with a lot of texture, it's going to make subsequent layers on top of it a bit of a hassle. So for every choice you make, not just in painting, but I guess in life in general, there's always some pros and cons and consequences, right? So, and I think that as you learn more about painting, you learn what those consequences are. Okay, there we go. So what we're doing is sort of using heavy body paints, and heavy body is, when I say that, that's the sort of the technical term for your standard acrylic paint that comes in the tube from your art supply store. So, you know, if you've bought a tube of paint and you're like, I don't know, is this heavy body or soft body or fluid acrylic? What? Chances are it's probably heavy body paint. You know, again, heavy body paint, if I shake it, I don't hear anything, right? It's thick, it's like toothpaste, it's a thick body of paint. And it's great for doing almost everything we've ever done, but for doing kind of more detail work like this, not as much. We can do it, and I'm going to do this painting with it. I think you'll see that, you know, it's a little bit more of a frustration than it was when I painted with the fluid acrylic, which is, you know, I use that at the beginning, and that might inspire some people to go out and buy some fluid acrylics. Like if you're doing a lot of fine detail work, if you're really into patterning, you might find fluid acrylics are like a miracle. They're like it's such a welcome bit of fresh air. But if you're into kind of more big, thick paintings, fluid acrylics are are just useless for that, right? By the way, I think this painting would also look really nice just on a plain white canvas, just like Picasso did here. I just wanted to show people that I think it's you know, if you're doing a painting like this, there's the potential or the invitation to customize it a little bit, as I think you should feel free to do with any of the paintings we've done, but this one maybe more so, perhaps. Like you don't, this could be a pink line or a red line, purple, black. You could paint, take a black canvas and do this with white paint. Okay, before I can't reach this area here, I'm just going to come up. Sorry, just take a little sip of water there. just going to keep on moving, and then I'm going to go back over all of these lines a second time and probably widen them a bit. So the point is just to get all the lines on here, and then we can evaluate and see what needs to be done to get them a little bit sharper and more even. Not that they do need to be even either, right? They could be fairly rough. We saw the original drawing that Picasso did with crayon, you know, is really rough. You know, it actually looks you know, I think quite inferior to the print that was made of it. So clearly what happened is he did the drawing, and then subsequently either himself or somebody else transferred that onto like a stone that was used for printing, or an etching plate, or some kind of printmaking method, and in doing so smoothed out the lines and made it look much cleaner than the original image was. Which is really interesting, because you think to yourself like, okay, well, now so which is better? Is it the looser, kind of more sketchy, a little bit more sloppy version that he did, or the cleaner, more you know, I don't know, just the more graphic looking version that I imagine he didn't do. I imagine an assistant did later on. Okay, so I've got all the blue on here now, but it's a little bit patchy, so I'm gonna have to go over it again. I mean, I like how that, well, I mean, I don't have to go over it again, but I will. But just because I want something a little bit more clean looking, and some of it is a little bit patchy. So where should I start? I'm going to start here in this belly. So when in doubt, if a line needs to be thicker, I'm thinking of it almost like calligraphy, that the thicker line should be on the bottom where the weight is and where there's probably some shadow, versus if I do want to vary the lines and have thicker or thinner lines, then probably on the top where the, so let's say this line could be thinner, this line would be thicker. Thin, thick, thin, thick. Mostly thin, maybe underneath here thicker, thin, thick, thin, thick, thin, thick, thin, and then all of this could be kind of thick. Does that make sense? So that's why I started with under here, because this is the underside of the bird, so this would be one of the darkest parts of the bird, so where we would expect, you know, a big shadow to be. So I wanted to kind of practice a thicker line down there. Let's and this time I am using more paint because I really don't want to have to go over it again, so hopefully a thicker application of paint will make for a relatively opaque line. It does get a little bit more dangerous when you're using, dangerous, relatively, no one's life is at stake with a painting, but, you know, if you're doing detail work with a lot of paint on your brush, there is the potential that if you're not careful that you could press too hard, boom, you got a big wide line here. If I did do something like that, you'd want to have a little rag or something close by that's clean that you might be able to quickly dip into some water and then try wiping it away. But there is, you know, the fact that we have this one solid color on the background means it's a little bit less forgiving for accidents, right? Unlike some of our other paintings where there's lots of stuff going on, if there was a big smudge right across here where you're trying to clean up paint, not really anywhere for that to hide, right? So that's why doing a painting like this, you know, the tendency to be like, oh yeah, it'll take me 20 minutes and we'll be done this one. We'll be done, you know, this whole episode, you know, this will be like a 40-minute episode. And you're like, how is it possible we're still 2 hours into this here, we're not done? It's because because there is less work, we kind of have to be that much more careful. You know, and another example, I love like cooking competition TV shows or whatever. You know, and if you only have like one or two ingredients and you got to cook those together, then like if they, I'm sure they've done a thing where you've got to make rice, the best rice. Well, if that's the only thing on the menu is like the perfect bowl of rice, you know, then you've really, it's not like you're gonna pour a big sauce over top of it. And if the rice is a little bit overdone or underdone, it's kind of like it's just a delivery mechanism for a sauce or stew or something, right? So it can kind of hide a little bit. But if that's all there is, then boy, you got to get it right? Let's zoom back in here. So I'm going to allow this line to kind of get a bit thinner and thicker, right? You can see where I'm letting this one kind of get much thinner. And I might vary the thickness as we go up here. So I might leave this, oops, that a little thinner and do this one thicker. Although I still want to paint it, just want to keep it thin. That was a little thick. Well, I'll just keep on going. I'm not going to make any judgments until I zoom out and see the whole thing all at once, because my nose is like half a foot away from the canvas, so I'm not in the proper position to make any judgments about the overall composition at this point, right? I'll let that dry and just go back over to the other wing here that I can access. In fact, I'm just going to wipe, as all this paint starts to build up on there, and that just starts becoming a pain. So let's just clean that brush. Yeah, it looks like I did mine a little bit differently than his, but I'm not gonna cry over it. So this is great practice for people who want to get better at doing some line work. Again, I know there's probably going to be some sign painters who look at this and go like, ah, I would not have approached that painting that way. But I'm not a sign painter, and that technique for me, I've never been able to quite master it. So, I mean, a good episode maybe would be for me to try to do a little bit of that. But not today. So my goal will be to finish up here in about half an hour. Should be more than enough time to finish these lines and then the small line work inside. See, the thing is, what I don't like about heavy body paint when you're trying to do this, everything starts to get kind of gummy and sticky like this, and so I'm always having to try to get some of that excess paint off. Like, this is that question of paint drying quickly. This is what's happening, is the paint is starting to kind of seize up as it's sitting there on the palette in big gobs, and as it starts to dry, it becomes less and less, fluid and more viscous, thick, and which is great for some types of painting, but this type of painting, not so much. So at this point, I look at it, I'm pretty happy with the kind of modifying the thickness and thinness of these brush strokes. But I won't really know until I've gone all the way around, done the head as well, and then I'll evaluate. And then potentially I might decide, well, I think I'd like more of a single, constant, continuous line. Let's do this head now. Keeps getting thicker up here because it's a little less opaque. Not happy about that. So I'll let that dry because now it just needs to dry before I do more work on the face. I mean, I know this is a little bit tedious, but I actually quite like doing this. It takes some focus, for sure. This is maybe not the best thing for people with an unsteady hand, but I do, I mean, I don't know, I'm not a doctor, but I would think that like doing this type of thing might help build some concentration in muscles. I could also, someone could make the argument that it could make things worse, maybe, I don't know. Okay, let's look back here. Yeah, let's okay. I'm just going to okay. Maybe while I'm here, I'll do his signature, and then we've just got the yellows and reds and things in there. And I might even add a little bit of white as a foundational color in there before I do those things. And then I'll take a look at the chat, because I know there's a bunch of people posted tons of things in there, so I'll just do a quick look, see what I've missed. Okay, so now let's just take a look at this one, where we're at now. So, I believe, like, I'm not sure what the blue is in here, if that's just style, or if he intends that to be, like, claws or feathers. Is that all the blue in here? We got it all? Paula says, "Hi Lolly, you can check the Go Boomerang. They have oil painting classes. There are water mixable oil paints. It dries in a day." And Lolly says, "Yeah, I'm going to go back through some of your streams, Michael, learning a lot. Do you have a favorite stream painting you did or artist you worked from? I watched the palette knife ones you mentioned. They were great." And Lolly says, "Thanks, Paula. I'll check out the Go Boomerang. Is Go Boomerang, is that on YouTube? I don't know. I haven't heard of that." Okay. What should I do next? Let's do the red. Let's take... Actually, I got some warm red. Is any of this still usable? Can I get away with that? Not really. So I feel a little bit more freedom with these marks than I do with anything else in here. So I feel like I can paint this a little bit with thicker paint on my brush, because I'm not really... These honestly kind of feel like a little bit of afterthoughts, the way that he painted these. Or drew them, I mean, right? Because this is, again, this is a drawing that has been... We're transforming into a painting. Just keep that like that. Okay. Okay. Let's move on to some yellow and green, and then we're done, right? So Lolly's question, do I have a favorite painting? You know, people have asked me that, what's my favorite painting that we've done, or techniques. I've got, I mean, there's very few of them that I'm not happy with. I really liked the way the Van Gogh potato eaters turned out. I was really happy with that, because that for me was one of those paintings I was like, this is a bit of a challenge. I like the girl with the pearl earring we did way back in like January. I think we did that one, and that was part of the previous intro to painting course that I did. I was really happy with that, because that was sort of like the most difficult painting I had done as part of one of these classes. Maybe it was a bad idea that it turned out well, because I think it was a little bit longer. And I was like, well, you know what, now we can do girl with some Vermeer, then let's do Mona Lisa, let's do some... And then you have like a 7-hour Diego Rivera painting. So maybe if that painting hadn't turned out so well, I wouldn't have got it in my mind that I can do other things as well. So, you know, I think like I did with the blues, I'm going to mix the two yellows that I have together here to get a bit brighter of a yellow. Because I don't like the cold yellow on its own, and I find the warm yellow is maybe a little bit orangey, especially with this gray background. So I'm kind of mixing them up, so I've got a bit of a color in between the colors. And you'll notice this if you go to your art supply store, you'll have, like this would be, you have like Hansa yellow deep, Hansa yellow medium, Hansa yellow light. And this would be more of like your Hansa yellow medium, or even Hansa deep, because it's not quite as bright as Hansa yellow light. Hansa is like often the color that we use for our cool colors. Yeah, so we're here. Let's do... You know what? I'm going to mix some white into this, and then I'll paint over it a second time. Because this yellow is not going to show up very well. So instead, I'm going to take this white, put some yellow in it. Maybe I was going to think about maybe painting yellow a second layer over top of this, but I don't mind how this looks yet. We'll see. Because it will also dry a little bit darker anyway. So let's see, maybe it needs more white. Okay, and then let's do some green. Let's back it out. I do have the same, just out of curiosity, yeah, it's seized up a lot, but that's interesting just to see how that fluid acrylic, how it dries on the palette after a while. It's interesting. I love this discussion in here. Shelly says, "I have to say, I did love the girl with the pearl earrings." And Gail says, "I loved the lady with the book." I'm not sure the right name, but that's, yes, it was Renoir who did that one for sure. Oh, I forgot there was the red down here by the feet. Let's do that while I still got some red fresh on the palette before I move on to the green. I like this. Again, this discussion. Lolly says, "I watched some of the girl with the pearl earring one. I haven't watched Potato Eaters one yet, but I love the range of different pieces you cover. I appreciate that. Definitely try to find as many different types of artists as possible so that we can talk and learn about as many different styles as possible." Gail says, "I think my favorite was the Jacob Lawrence Cubist style painting with the ball player." That's awesome. I loved that one too. That's good to hear, because I think that one, not as many people painted that one, at least at first. So that's always also interesting, is sometimes I'm doing these and there's only a few people watching, and then later on it explodes and there's like 300 or 400 people who've done it. I'm like, oh, I thought that was a lonely one. And then some of the other ones where there's a lot of people watching it first, and then afterwards it doesn't seem to grow as much. So you know, the way the internet works, I guess. I don't know. I'm going to take some cool blue. I'm going to mix a green, because I get a nice kind of bright green with this cool blue. So let's put this here. I'll even get a bit of white in there. Maybe it'll go a bit teal. Maybe I'll paint over it again later, but I'm not sure. I don't know if I want a darker green or a lighter green. We'll see within moments here what the effect is. Maybe let's start up by the beak. I think this color will work well. Like, I might keep it fairly simple like that, even though he did more work there, but I'll see. When we're all done, we can always add more lines and make it more complex, but okay. So I'll be so curious to see how many people actually went ahead and did today's painting. Because I know a lot of people watch and do other things, work on other paintings while I'm doing these, so it's always also so fascinating to see as they start rolling in on the Facebook page. Oops, I was a little bit off screen, sorry there. Here we are. I think I might be happy with the yellow like that. Kind of like that it glows a little bit. Just because it's got that bit of white in it. I don't know if there's room for this other bit of green there, so maybe that's it. So, let's zoom out and just take a look. Hi, Shamsa, I see you there in the chat. Great to see you again. I was showing some of your work to some of my students the other day. So, you're inspiring the next generation of artists. So it's good to see you in the chat there. And hope your first couple weeks of school have gone well. And I'll be on campus tomorrow for the first time teaching in person in almost a year, well, over a year and a half. Anyway, okay. So, can I live with that? There's a few areas in the blue that are a little bit, you know, don't have quite the expressive fluidity that I would have liked, that is a big part of this painting. But it can be, you know, I am, if I decide, well, you know, let's just go in and tackle it, it could be a bit of a mistake. Like, if it's not a like, you know, like I think of it as, if it's not a major problem, then maybe it's just best just leaving it as it is. You know, like, so you might be just asking for more trouble if you try to go in and fiddle with things. You know, it's that whole idea of, like, jumping the shark, if you've ever heard of that term. You know, it's like, you're at the peak. Sometimes no painting is perfect. There's not a single painting in human history that is perfect. Yes, you know, if you were to be able to go back in time and talk to Leonardo and ask him about the Mona Lisa, he'd be like, oh, that one, I worked on that painting for years. It gave me fits. And you're like, are you serious? In the future, everyone thinks it's the best painting ever. There's long lines just to get into the Louvre in Paris to see it. And he's like, oh, really? Oh, you're telling me there's like millions of people look at that? That's like, oh, I've done so many other things. I've like, you talk to any artist, and they'll have that feeling of frustration over their work, because often we are the only ones that see those problems. So, you know, if I show this to my wife later, and I'll be like, yeah, but look at this area here. Don't you think, isn't that? And she'd be like, I don't really know what you're talking about. Like, what, is it too pointy or not? No, but you see how it's not quite wide enough there? It's just like, and she'd be like, that's the kind of thing that you're worrying about. Well, you're certainly lucky if that's the biggest worry in your life, Michael, right? So keep things in perspective. So yeah, I don't know. I could walk away from all of these right now. So let's how can I arrange this here so we can see both of them side by side. Out a bit. Oh yeah, now we got more room, but I love I'm kind of a bit oops, why did that tilt? I'll never get it right. It drives me crazy when things are crooked. Okay. It's interesting that I decided to put that signatures down there. Yeah, it doesn't, not a big deal, but it's cool to see them both together like that. Yeah, maybe let's. Sometimes at the end of the day, I think I want one where we have the split screen like this. There's one. And then there's the other one. Again, that color, very different, but I'm actually quite happy with the way that turned out. I feel like that color is appropriate for the image. So let's put some autograph stuff on here. Which one is this? This is there's one. And here is the other one. There's the Dove of Peace and the Peace Dove. I wonder if there's someone more intelligent than me who could point out the difference between the Peace Dove and the Dove of Peace. Is there, in fact, could a distinction be made? I just got my little fingerprints. Now this is dangerous. Let's see if I could just clean up that a bit. Okay, that worked. Because sometimes, yeah, I get my fingers on it when I'm, ideally I would do this after, tomorrow after they've dried, but don't always have that. I kind of want to do it all on camera too, so. You'll be on camp. I'll be, what time? I don't even remember. My class tomorrow, I think, is in the afternoon. So maybe I'll see it. I'll be coming as you're going, so maybe we'll cross paths there tomorrow, Shamsu. Lolly says, it looks cool. I'd be happy to have this on my wall. Perfect. And Shamsu says, yes, it has your uniqueness, and that's what makes it different. I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, every painting we make is a unique, different painting. And that's what's exciting, is their individual expressions of who we are. Even if we're painting a famous image by Picasso or Van Gogh or Frida Kahlo or Mary Pratt, Emily Carr, like, I think who we are sort of just comes out no matter what, and that's a great thing. And the more that you do these kind of things, the more that your style will just will happen accidentally, and then you start noticing those tendencies, and then you can either hide them and do something else, or decide to amplify them, right? And I think that's what gets really exciting. And then you start kind of noticing, I like doing some paintings more than others, and then I'm going to start kind of using those techniques to express my own self and my own ideas, and that's ultimately where we want to get to. So if you've been making your own artwork, I'd love to see those things on the Facebook group as well, because I think it's 2 weeks from now. I'll have to look at the schedule. We're going to have another feedback episode coming up soon, so I can't wait to see what people have been doing as we go into the fall of the year. There's been some great things on the Facebook group recently, especially those of you who've been painting with me for a while. It's like that's, as a teacher, when you see people taking flight and making, like I don't want to embarrass anybody, but part of me wants to go back and look at some of the artwork that you guys were uploading that we looked at a year ago and compare them to what you've done today. And I think it's just like, because I remember some of those earlier paintings. Not that they were bad, but it's compared. It's just the development is extraordinary. So that makes it's, for me, it's very life affirming, right? In all honesty, like it's it feels like it gives me some purpose to my life, and feels like this is useful time. If I'm helping other people grow as artists, and if more and more people become artists around the world, that's a great thing. And if I can contribute to that in any small way, especially on a day like today, International Day of Peace, then we're just one more tiny step forward to living in a world where war is just some crazy thing that people used to do, and you're just like, really, that happened? People fought and killed each other over stupid things like land and resources and oil, and like, man, thank goodness that's a figment of the past. I'm not quite there yet, but I have faith that maybe hopefully maybe during my daughter's lifetime, or her children's lifetime, or my great-grandchildren's lifetime, that they can experience a world absent of violence and war and tyranny and etc., right? And again, as much as Picasso is a conflicted and flawed person, he did leave some incredible images for us. And that debate of, can we like art made by people we don't like, is a really interesting philosophical discussion that we won't answer today. But anyway, it's taken me a year to get around to Picasso, and we'll spend a week looking at Picasso in October. We're going to look at some of his greatest paintings of all time, from the Rose period, the Blue period, the Cubist period. We're going to do 2 Cubist paintings. We're going to look at one of the paintings he did for Guernica, which is, again, it's sort of like the opposite to this type of painting. This painting, is hopeful and beautiful and inspiring, this dove of peace, right? That's something anybody can get behind that. Guernica is a painting that depicts the Nazi bombing of the Spanish town of Guernica before World War II, kind of think, officially began, and it was kind of a horrific atrocity, massacre of this bombing of this civilians. And Picasso made that painting in response to it, as a way of bringing attention to it. And quite honestly, would anybody remember or even know what Guernica is if it wasn't for Picasso? And that's anyway. We're going to be talking about Guernica when we talk about Guernica, but you know, just in the context of talking about peace, I think it's worth just kind of briefly mentioning. And anyway, so thank you everyone. All these beautiful comments in here. I really appreciate this. Just quickly, Lolly says, how often are these live streams? So every Tuesday and Thursday, definitely at 4 p.m. Pacific time, I am here live, and probably mostly that for the next 3 months. There's a few times where I'm on Fridays and, you know, maybe Mondays, Saturdays, Sundays, but if you want to set your calendar to Tuesdays and Thursdays, that's when I'm here for sure. So, because I'm just getting really busy with teaching the one that actually pays. So, speaking of which, if you want to leave a donation, there's a PayPal link in the description below. Any contribution, large or small, is greatly appreciated, and it has contributed to creating this wonderful space for me to be here on Tuesdays and Thursdays with you. So thank you everyone for doing that. If you want to use the PayPal link, it's below. If you want to send a e-transfer or check, contact me through the Facebook group or my email, which is on my website. Links are all in the description below. Thank you everyone once again. Take a moment to think about how we might be able to contribute towards making our society, our world, a more peaceful place on this day of peace. And we'll see you guys on Thursday when we look at a very different artist, Tamara de Lempicka. I think one of the greatest, well, obviously one of the greatest artists of all time, but a very iconic woman who was created some incredible Art Deco paintings. I don't think we've even talked about Art Deco over the past year, so we're going to launch into something very different, so I'm really excited about that. Okay, everyone, enjoy the rest of your evening, and we will see you on Thursday. Until then, happy painting, and we'll see you soon. Goodbye, everybody.